Okay, so we had mentioned hemoglobin in the last slide as being a big component of what makes up a red blood cell. Hemoglobin molecules look like the picture over on the right. Now, obviously, of course, this is not something you're ever going to have to remember as far as the structure goes, other than the fact that it is a protein that is able to hold iron molecules, okay, or sorry, iron atoms rather. So what you're seeing here are four proteins that are working together. So if you remember back from biology, this is what we call a quaternary protein, right? So you have four molecules kind of like intertwined working together. Uh, and they're made up of two different types of proteins, A chains and B chains. So in other words, there's two A chains or alpha chains, and there's two beta chains. Um, the heme is the molecule that kind of looks like a little like rectangular Saturn you can see in here. And if you look closely, there are four in the picture. That's the molecule that has the high affinity for oxygen and holds oxygen temporarily, right? It's based on an iron atom, as you can see, and that's what allows hemoglobin and therefore red blood cells, which contain hemoglobin, to carry oxygen around the body. This is a reversible reaction, so oxygen can be picked up and dropped off, right, to cells that need it. And we'll talk about how that works a little bit later. But I wanted to make sure everybody understood because I always think that scale, the sort of sense of scale is a little bit lost sometimes. So if we go back to this slide here, how many molecules, how many heme or hemoglobin molecules do you think fit in one of these red blood cells? 10, 100, 1,000? All right, so just want to say there's a little bit more room to write on this slide. There are 270 million molecules of hemoglobin in each red blood cell, right? So that's a huge amount of molecules, right? Um, each one of these can hold four oxygens, right? Because there's four heme molecules per or four heme sites per molecule, right? So what's that? That's like a billion oxygen molecules can be carried by one red blood cell. And if you multiply that by the amount of blood in the body, it's something like 2.5 times 10 to the 13th cells, right? So you do the math. I'm just showing you that, the blood, a normal amount of blood in an adult person has a huge capacity to carry oxygen, right? So it's just an amazing system. And hey, it works. You take a breath and it goes all right to your cells. Okay, so I do want to mention, I think it would really be remiss of me to not mention this. The only way that this system works is if you make proper hemoglobin proteins, right? They're the ones that carry the heme, which bonds to the oxygen, right? If you don't make proper hemoglobin proteins because of a genetic mutation, which we call sickle cell anemia, the globin proteins, the actual protein part that is made by the cells themselves, is not formed correctly, making oxygen transport difficult. So, low oxygen content. So when somebody's hypoxic, they're breathing, they're trying to keep up with exercise, or they're at high altitude, or something like that. That can change the shape of these proteins and make them sickle shaped. Okay, which is interesting. So if you see right over here in this micrograph, you can see that that sickled cell here is obviously a much different shape than the other, what we call normal cells. Now, this causes traffic jams in the bloodstream. There are some blood vessels in your body called capillaries that are small enough to only allow one blood cell through at a time. So they're crazy tiny little passageways. Now, how I like to explain this is if you've ever been to like a water park that had a lazy river, right? Lazy river is basically where you sit in an inner tube and, with your friends or family or whoever you're with, you just kind of like drift around the park really, really slowly. That's kind of what I think of as like the circulatory system, right? Well, why do they put you in round inner tubes? The reason that they do that, and sorry about that, that's the bell. The reason that they do that is because, if you crash into another blood cell or inner tube, you'd bounce right off, right? If you get to a corner in the river, you can basically just kind of like roll right through that corner, right? If you have a couple of inner tubes or a bunch of inner tubes jammed up in a corner, it's pretty easy to get round, inner tubes out simply because of their shape, right? Same thing goes for blood cells. Round blood cells are able to squeeze and bend and get through very, very small blood vessels with no problem. What if instead of at that water park, they gave you kayaks instead of inner tubes. Well, that would be awful. First of all, kayaks are kind of hard to pilot if you don't know what you're doing at the very beginning. But second of all, can you imagine a whole bunch of kayaks getting to a narrow spot in the river? Everybody get jammed up, flipped over, maybe stuck, and that's what happens with people that have sickle cell anemia. They just can't get those blood cells efficiently through the blood vessels to carry oxygen to the tissues that need it, right? So obviously you can see the problem here. If you get clots in your circulatory system, that can lead to some really bad things like heart attacks and strokes. So definitely good to have those round blood cells and a normal shaped hemoglobin molecule within them. So I do want to bring this up. I'm just representing the bug side of my career, here. So malaria is one of the most awful parasitic infections really the world has ever seen. As of a few years ago, I really should probably update this slide. There's 500 million malaria infections annually. If you think about it, that's about a 14th of the world, right? Pretty crazy. Maybe about a 15th of the world. And annually with about 5 million deaths, right? Most of them are children under about 3 years old or so, right? Well, why is this? Because malaria parasites, as you can see in this bottom picture here, malaria parasites will actually get into red blood cells, parasitize them, use them up, and then, you can see the cells being lysed here. They're being split open by what's called the trophozoite stage of malaria. And those cells, of course, die. Okay. What's weird is people that have sickle cell anemia. Now, you may think that, wow, that's awful. I would never want to have that disease. In areas where malaria is really, really prevalent, very, very high prevalence rate, the sickled cells actually make blood cells more resistant to the attack by these parasites, which is kind of interesting if you think about it. So, if you go here and look at two maps, which you can overlay, the prevalence map of sickle cell anemia is basically, Saharan and sub-Saharan Africa, Madagascar, up in the Mediterranean, the Middle East, and India. Okay. If you look at the prevalence map for malaria, it is a really great overlay. I mean, it's a very, very predictive here of what's going on. So what I'm saying here is hopefully this makes sense to you. Genetic diseases like sickle cell anemia really probably should have died out a long time ago. People that have sickle cell are, actually, you know, it can be a lethal condition, right? At least it's really going to affect your quality of life, high morbidity, if not mortality. Um, if you think about malaria, malaria is an infectious disease. You have to catch it. The only way you can get it is by getting bitten by a mosquito. Okay? So, what is this saying here? Malaria, which is awful, right? It's got that really high, prevalence and death rate, might actually be keeping sickle cell anemia in the human population, right? So, in other words, you actually have a better chance of surviving in these areas here on the map if you have anemia because the force of malaria infection is so high, right? So in other words, what disease is going to make you survive better, sickle cell anemia or malaria? A lot of times it's sickle cell anemia, which is why it's still in the human population. So it's really interesting to think about that. I also want to kind of clear up. A lot of people think that people with sickle cell are only African, in origin. That's definitely not true. Okay, so people from India, as you can see, people from the Middle East, and people from the Mediterranean. I mean, you can be a Sicilian, right, and have the genes for sickle cell anemia. So it's not just an African thing. Okay, there are other types of anemia that I think are obviously way more common than sickle cell that we should probably talk about. So anemia leads to a decrease in blood hemoglobin. That's really what the term anemia is describing. Okay, so this leads to, and you got to think about it. What's the functions of the blood, and what's going to happen to me if I'm not producing enough? Well, if you're not getting enough oxygen to your cells, that's going to lead to general fatigue and malaise. You're not going to really have a whole lot of energy, in other words. It's also going to cause an increased cardiac output. It's rough on your heart. Because you don't have a whole lot of blood, your heart is trying to pump what you do have around as fast as possible to deliver oxygen to your cells. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. What factors can cause anemia? Number one would be a poor diet. Not only do you need protein, right? You need protein to make protein, right? So you need protein to make hemoglobin. But the other thing you need is iron, right? Remember how we talked about thyroid hormone? It doesn't work without iodine. Well, hemoglobin doesn't work without iron. Iron is what actually gets the oxygen to stick to red blood cells so that they can carry it around the body. So I think that's important too, is that that poor diet, if it's deficient in iron, and this happens even in this country, a lot of people that are anemic are on iron supplements to help their blood carry more oxygen around, right? So it's just in countries where you can't get those iron supplements or you can't get red meat, which is extremely high in iron. That's that can lead to problems. Okay. The globin mutation, right? So obviously here we're talking about sickle cell anemia. If you don't make the proper hemoglobin and it's the wrong shape, it is not going to allow any of that oxygen to be carried around because it's going to be jammed up in the smaller blood vessels in the body, and that's obviously not good. I think the third one is probably pretty obvious, the most obvious and probably the most common out of any of these, and that would be injury or hemorrhage, right? If you open up a major blood vessel under the pressure that your heart and your other tissues put on your circulatory system, the vessel's big enough, you can bleed out pretty quick. Your femoral artery, your aorta, very, very big blood vessels. Your aorta is almost about the same diameter as like a garden water hose, right? If that were to be injured from an aneurysm or, a car accident, you smash your chest into the steering wheel and rupture that vessel, that can lead to bleeding out pretty quick, right? So, what's the deal there? Well, if you don't have enough cells with enough hemoglobin and enough pressure to carry that oxygen around your body, cells start to die, right? They can't go get it themselves. So, of course, they're going to suffer, and under a lot of circumstances, especially nerve cells, which are very, very greedy and very, very dependent on a constant oxygen supply, they're going to start to die. That's obviously not good. So hemorrhages should be stopped as quickly as possible, and we'll talk more about clotting and how that naturally occurs, in the body a little bit further down in this presentation. But obviously, there are things you can do for first aid. Pressure is a really good way to stop bleeding, right? So if somebody cuts their arm, I remember in our school I had taught before, one of the kids in the old school building windows that used to tilt out, and they were glass, pressed on the glass instead of the frame. The glass broke, arm went through the window, and cut some major blood vessels. I don't know which ones at this point because I was young too. In their arm. Teacher put pressure on it until the nurse could get there. Kid was fine, but the pressure definitely holds, and allows the blood to slow down enough to clot sometimes. Just putting pressure on there anyway keeps the blood from leaving the body, which is really kind of like the whole point of, pressing on that wound. Okay. We'll talk about other ways if you guys have questions about it, tourniquets and things like that, right? But for now, I think I'm going to end this video a little bit early because what we're talking about next is white blood cells. I know we're only at like 13 minutes and change here, but I think this is a good time to stop. So on to video number 3.